Hey y'all! Well, we're back to the R300 and been waiting on some stuff to get shipped here. Got some transformers to try. We're still waiting on one, maybe two options to get mailed to me. One, still waiting on Thermionic Labs, which they're sending a 4K that they're winding specifically for this use case. So that should be an interesting one to see. But we have ISO Tango FC20S, which is their 20 water multi-tap. Then we have their pretty much designed specifically for a 300B amp, which is the FC30 3.5S2. So this is the newest version that they have of this 300B transformer, and you can see it's a beast. Then we have these two head cores. We tried this little 3.5K one in the last video series and saw that the output transformer is absolutely what's causing that weird frequency response and crazy square waves. Basically some kind of capacitance interweaving something that's sending the output towards a dead short at the upper frequency ranges, which is not a good thing for the tubes or anything. And I did see verification from a message that China Hi-Fi sent out to a customer, and you can see it on stereo.net, that they're telling folks that the new R300 Plus has got different output transformers in addition to having the 5AR4 tubes for the rectifiers, and they admit that the earlier ones had issues with the rectifiers, the power supply. I mean, they're not saying, hey, we're going to fix these for you, but they seem to be saying, hey, we've got a version 2, which I find comical that when they upgraded the R300 to fix the problems that it had, they're calling it a version 2, but they get all upset when I looked at their R8 that had all the problems fixed and claimed that, okay, here's a version 2. They're saying, oh, there's no version 2, they're all the same. But we know better than that. So let's get back to trying to fix this R300. Obviously, if we're going to try to put something like this little ED cord on here, they're going to sit there kind of like that. And while it may work great, aesthetically, it doesn't really match this towering cans full of gravel and little transformer inside it that the factory look has. And so you're probably going to want to go to somewhere, eBay or whatever, and get some can, and it looks like that a stock size can will fit right over the top of this thing. Maybe paint it silver to match the front might look good, because you're probably not going to be able to match this funky blue kind of metallic-y paint they put on here. Somebody does find like a spray bomb match to this, or some car paint spray bomb stuff that matched, you could put it in the description or email me, because that would be nice to be able to paint them to match this. But trying to match colors like this is not going to be easy, and I think they'd look fine if they were painted this kind of contrasting silver color on the transformer cans. So that may be an option. If we go up to this next size ISO transformer, I actually think those would look fine. I think you can probably notch this out a little bit in the front and pull this forward enough to cover up those two holes. But if not, you could center it and just leave those holes there. And, it is what it is. But I think this matches these a lot better. And I think it's a little wider in that direction, so you could put it that way. And I think those would look fine. These big ones, I think, are going to, by the time, because it's sitting on top of the screw heads, I think when you get them set down there, they're going to be level and pretty much the same size as the cans that were there. And I'm pretty sure these are going to rock and roll. And probably going to be the easiest to install. They're also the most expensive. But they are single tap wound primary for a 300B tube. And they've got plenty of amperage capacity to deal with, biasing these tubes as hot as you need to. And again, the big core size, I can't imagine that these aren't going to perform the best, but we're going to see. The other thing nice about this option is this is a multi-tap. So we'll be able to compare 3.5K and 5K primary impedance using the same transformer. And so we can see which one that this amp really likes. Like I said, Thermionic Labs said 4K sounded right to them, but I feel like 3.5 is going to be real close. The other thing really nice about this transformer is it's got 16, 8, 6, 4, and of course the ground terminal on this turret. So if we feel like that 3.5K is a little low for the voltage and the bias point they're running the 300B tubes at, we could run the 8 ohm on the 6 ohm tap here and be able to get to that same reflected impedance. And it's got the 16 ohm tap to hook the feedback up to directly without having to, recalculate that. I'm hoping that these better transformers won't need any negative feedback, but we won't know that until we start hooking them up. I have a feeling that the distortion that we're seeing that's requiring this negative feedback has got something to do with how low they've biased the 6SL7 driver tube. And that may be something we need to address as well. Again, this project has turned into a lot more than I was anticipating when I first started working on it. Honestly, I wish I'd never even messed with this thing. It's turned into such a fiasco, and I spend, half an hour every day at least responding to emails I've turned into like the help support line for Willsenton about how to fix these amplifiers, because I guess they're not responding to people. So yeah, I guess that's kind of the position I ended up putting myself into. I'm like the Willsenton expert now. But anyway, let's get hooking up these things. Again, we can just pull the wires out of here and leave the transformer sitting over here to the side and hook the outputs up to that. Probably going to run all these with no negative feedback to start with, and then hook up the negative feedback and compare, like this to this, apples and apples, best case scenario, both of them with the feedback running. And again, I'm hoping that we can get to the point where we don't need any negative feedback, because that's kind of the core of what a 300B amp is it's a direct heated triode with zero negative feedback. And it's probably why my DIY amp sounds so much better than this one. Not only has it got better output transformers, the circuit doesn't need negative feedback for it to not have crazy high distortion. So anyway, let's get to trying these transformers and seeing what we've got here. Okay, so we've got both the transformers hooked up, and they're both set at 3.5K, and you can see they're all but identical, which is very similar to what we saw with the little ED core. And this one has multi-tap, so we can adjust the different impedances and see what changes that makes. And right here we're seeing that going from the total garbage output transformer these come with to a really high quality one, we're not seeing any difference in the THD, which is odd. So then we go to the frequency response, and there you see the story. Got a little bit of roll off here on the bottom end, a couple of dBs at 20. By the time you get to 40 hertz, they're both doing pretty good. From here to the highest peak, you're only going to see maybe a quarter of a dB, which you're never going to hear. And I'm just really not concerned about what's going on at 20 hertz. I'm more looking at where are we at 40. That's when you start hearing stuff. And again, you got maybe a quarter of a dB roll off on both of them. But here on the top end, you got a total different story. And you see the red, which is the stock transformer, takes this nosedive starting at 3K And by the time you get to 7K, you've already got over a dB of roll off. By the time you get to 10K, it's easily 2.5. This little dip here we're seeing in the blue is caused by this humongous spike here from the stock output transformer, showing how really bad it is. So here's where we're seeing the difference in the transformer quality is in this frequency response curve. But honestly, this isn't really a huge difference from what we saw with the little ED core. So now we come over the THD versus frequency. And let's take a really close look at what's going on here. We can see here the higher quality output transformer has got less distortion here on the low end. Down at 20 hertz, we got 4 instead of 7. By the time you get to 30, we got still about a percent of distortion difference. 40 hertz, they're getting close to the same again. But look at the lower left spectrum analysis. The even order and the odd order harmonics are even. You can see that first and second spikes are like right there. So if we plot the second order harmonics, they both drop down the same amount. Go to third order, same deal. And this is showing us that we've got almost the same amount of odd order harmonics that we have with even order, which is not going to sound good. And given that we've got a much higher quality output transformer and we're not seeing any difference, that's telling me that it's coming from before the output tube. There's something in the front end tubes and their configuration that's creating a bunch of distortion. So I'm going to shut the amp off right here. We're going to hook up the global negative feedback and show you what that looks like. Okay, so here we've got the global negative feedback connected up to the 16 ohm tap of both transformers. And once again, you can see the performance on this THD versus frequency is all but identical. So we go to the frequency response. And again, the red channel is the factory transformer and the blue one is the ISO transformer. And you can see with the negative feedback hooked up, we've got better low frequency response, and it's all but flat across this whole range, especially with the ISO transformer. And this dip right here is caused from this massive dip on the factory transformer. In fact, let me go ahead and make a pull with the right channel disconnected and do it on just the blue channel so you can see how flat this frequency response really is without the influence of that other bad transformer. As you can see now, that little dip up here is totally gone. So this little FC20S transformer, if you're looking for a repair of this frequency response problem, you can see from 20 hertz up to 10, it's absolutely flat. And then if you look up in the upper right, you see where it says negative 0.11 dB. And then when we go to 20, it's negative 0.49. That's 0.3 of a dB. Never hear it. So this is honestly 20 to 20K hertz output transformer performing flawlessly. Let's go over here back to our THD versus frequency and see what adding the global feedback did. Again, this is pulling at 4 watts, which is pretty steep into the distortion curve. We're right here, and you can see it's a little over 1% on both sides. So we're definitely getting a true feel of what the THD is. And if you look at total THD here, it's just like what we saw on the other screen. It's 1.2%, 1.3%, right in that range. Down here, 20 hertz is another story. You got 2.6 6% versus 5.5%. So got a good bit more distortion with the factory transformer down on the super low end frequency. But let's look at these second and third order harmonics, or the even and odd order harmonics. And there's the even order, which is the good kind, and there's the odd order. And that problem is not being caused by the output transformer. There's something else wrong with this amplifier. So while changing the output transformers will fix this frequency response problem, which obviously needs to be fixed, and with the global negative feedback hooked up, this THD isn't really a problem for a single-ended triode amp, especially if you're going to be using it in this, 2 to 4 watt range. It's going to sound good as far as the THD. That's not going to be objectionable. The problem is this even order to odd order harmonics is not why people buy a 300B amp. People buy a 300B amp to get even order harmonic distortion, not odd order. And I think what's going on is there's just something wrong with the way the front end tubes are configured in this cascade design that they've used, and it's just not going to really be what a 300B amp should be. Okay, and I want to show you the performance of my DIY 300B amp. And like I said in a previous video, before I did any of this objective testing, I listened to my DIY amp versus the R300, and it clearly sounded much better to me. And I'll show you what the measurements show. Okay, remember, this amp has 0 negative feedback, like none. And if you look at the distortion numbers, it's making 1% distortion at 5 watts. And right in this range here is about where it starts clipping, and that's at 7 watts. And it goes past 2% distortion. And then if we look at the scope screen, you can see it's just starting to clip here at 1.6 volts RMS in. And you can see right there, 1.6 volts RMS in. It's at 7 watts. So 7 watt amp has 1% distortion at 5 watts. If we look at the frequency response, down here at 10 hertz it's barely rolled off. And at 20 hertz it's flat. We've got a half a dB roll off at 10K. 15K we've got 1 dB roll off. And it doesn't hit 3 dBs till 24K. So this looks good to me. This is what it sounds like too. It's got really good bass response. And then we'll look at the THD versus frequency. This is the THD, and this is at 4 watts, and you can see it's below 1% here. And then when we do the second order harmonics, the line barely moves. We've got most of the THD is in second order harmonics, and then when we do third or odd order, it drops way down here to 0.3% distortion, which is going to be inaudible. Now, these transformers do have more THD at low frequencies than I'd like to see, and it's one of the reasons I want to try these ISO Tango 30 watt output transformers on this amp and see if I can clean up this low end frequency response. So we'll be doing that in a future video, but I wanted to highlight here how there's the total THD, second order harmonics, which is the majority of the THD, and when we go to the odd order, it drops way down here. And that's what we want to see. And again, this has 0 negative feedback, and it's just destroying the performance of that R300 that's running a ton of global negative feedback to try to get the performance anywhere near what this amp's doing. So there's something wrong, and it's got to be in the front end of the amp. And I think this is a good place to wrap up this video. Well, as you can see, that just ended up kind of being a mess. We ended up somewhere where I thought we were getting towards the end of this, but it's just opened another problem. And honestly, I shouldn't be surprised. If they don't know enough about tube amplifiers to know that you can't put a 330 UF cap right after a rectifier tube, and then they still stumbled along on like, what, 4 revisions? And then they ended up trying to put those delay boards in there, and when the solution was just replacing one capacitor, it shouldn't shock me that they can't design the front end of a 300B amp either. And given the distortion and the need to use negative feedback as a crutch to fix the distortion that's coming out of, it looks like they copied that Sun Audio JC Morrison thing just like Brysong did with the A50, but they stuck a 6SL7 tube as the first triode to try to crutch it into making enough drive to drive a 300B tube, and then they ended up with a ton of distortion, so they just stuck a bunch of negative feedback in it to cover that up. And it's a design that isn't worthy of ISO iron to me. And I know George is probably going to be, we were hopeful that maybe, some of this ISO iron would like take this amp to the next level, but there's so many other issues with the sonic quality that these transformers really are not going to shine in that amp. If you've got one of those amps and you've fixed the power supply and you want to just get the issue with the frequency response straightened out so it's not trying to short the outputs as it goes past 10K, I would just put some 15 watt Edcore 3.5Ks in it. If you take the global negative feedback and basically cut it in half and hook it up to the 8 ohm tap, it's going to sound so much better than what it is now. And honestly, I need to do that to one of the amps, is put those transformers on one of them. I've left the other one stock and sit down and listen to them. But I know it's going to sound better. I mean, it just from looking at the measurements and from what I know about, what changes on this audio analyzer screen show in actual use, I know it's going to sound better. But it's still not going to sound as good as this DIY 300B amp. And, when you sit down and think about it, I think it's about $1,200, probably close to $1,500 in parts to build one of these now. And do you really think you should be able to go buy a pre-built amp for $1,500 and it's going to have the same quality parts in it that this is? And it's going to sound like this? That's just not being realistic. Honestly, if you're not going to take it to like this level, don't buy a 300B amp. There's no point. If you're having to run global negative feedback on it, it defeats the whole purpose of even building a direct heated triode amplifier. By doing that, you're just dumbing it down to the lowest common denominator, which on the R300 is the junky front end design that it has. So, at this point, I feel like, unlike the R8, where they finally got it to a point, and it's a pretty bog standard push-pull amplifier circuit they're using. I mean, it's nothing, out of the box thinking on that. And that's probably why it works as good as it does. Their design of the 300B amp, never seen anybody do anything like they did on it. And it's not a win. whatever they're doing and trying to hide this from people. I don't know why you'd be trying to hide this. Nobody in their right mind would want to copy what they did. I know I've got no interest in copying that design. It makes no sense to me, and you can see from the results, it doesn't make the numbers that it should either. And it doesn't sound good. At least to me, it's not. And maybe, you know, if you're using a half a watt, I can't even say that though. If you're using a half a watt of power, go get that little Deckware EL84 amp. It's going to blow away what an R300 sounds like. Yeah, basically, I hate to say it, but if you bought one of those amps, you paid $1,500 for a chassis and a power transformer. The rest of it's got to get just gutted and rewired. I don't know what I'm going to do with these two I've got. I know one of the guys, he spent $1,500 on a pair of Western Electric tubes. And, you know, for those tubes, you should be running iron like this. You should be running a $1,000 pair of output transformers to really get out of those Western Electric tubes what they're capable of. But the rest of that circuit's so junky, it's not hardly even worth putting some of, you know, these 300B-Z tubes in one of those amps. You know, got to talk with those folks. Probably going to put a pair of Thermionic Labs output transformers in that one guy's amp. And then the other one, the guy's in no hurry. He said, yeah, if you want to just rewire the whole thing, I'm fine with that. So that might be another project in the future. I've got some ideas to try. The next thing I want to do is put these FC 3.5 S2s in this amp, and I'll show you the difference. I'm hoping to get the low-end response up from what these ED cores are doing. And one of these ED cores is acting a little flaky, and I'll show you that in a future episode. But, yeah, this FC20, probably going to use it for my 2A3 build. I've got all the parts to do that now, and I've got some good output transformers. So we can do that in the future. I want to get going on my EL34 12AX7 amp. And so, yeah, I think we're kind of done with this R300 thing for now. So, anyway, I'll probably report back maybe on a Monday monologue about what the R300 with the ED core or the Thermionic Labs transformers sounds like. And see, you know, if it's... I just almost feel like it's good money after bad trying to fix one of those up and turn it into anything. And honestly, at this point, I would say you'd be better off to just sell it. And if you don't have a lot of money and you really want a 300B amp, the Rysong A50, after my mods are done to it, is a much better amp than the R300. And it's about half the price now. I think they're selling for $800 or $900. And who knows what they did with this R300 Plus. I'm sure they're not giving anybody schematics in there. You know, well, we changed the output transformers. Maybe they changed the stickers on them like they did the choke. I don't know what they're doing. And at this point, I just want to move on from that whole family of products and get on to something that's not such a pain to deal with. So anyway, thanks for following through with this series. Like I said, we'll do one little short update about just a listening test, but I'm kind of done with those things for now. I need to move on to something that's more productive, not as frustrating, and actually has a chance of being something good. So anyway, again, if you enjoyed this series, please like the video, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks to you Patreon folks. Also, thanks to you folks that bring your gear over for me to use for testing so we can learn more about doing hi-fi on a budget. And until the next video, have a nice day.